What do you do when you find out your husband has been stealing from you for 2 years, methodically, patiently, with forged documents, and he has absolutely no idea that you know? You don't confront him. You wait. You build. And then you walk into a mediation room with a folder so thick his attorney went quiet in the middle of a sentence. That's exactly what I did. Daniel, my husband of 11 years, the man who had called me financially illiterate 3 weeks before that meeting, the man who had told me I was incapable of managing anything more complex than a grocery list. Daniel walked into that conference room smiling, confident, completely certain of how the next 2 hours were going to go, and I let him sit down. I let his attorney finish his entire opening statement, and then I reached into my bag. He went the color of old chalk. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how we got here. Not just the what, but the why, and the how long it took me to become someone who could sit in that room and say those 2 words without her voice shaking. My name is Claire Ashworth. I was 39 years old when this story ends, and 28 when it starts. I'm a structural engineer by training, the kind who looks at a building and instinctively calculates load-bearing walls, stress points, where the cracks will appear under pressure. I am telling you this because it turns out that skill translates, not just to buildings. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, the kind with one stoplight and a diner that served the same pie for 30 years. My mother worked as a bookkeeper for a local construction company. My father died when I was 11. Cardiac event, fast, no warning. And after that, it was my mother and my grandmother, Nana Ruth, and me, in a house that smelled like coffee and old wood floors. We were not poor, but we were careful. My mother could tell you the exact balance of every account she kept to the penny, and she taught me the same discipline by making me track every dollar of my allowance in a small spiral notebook from the time I was 9. Nana Ruth, though, Nana Ruth was the one who gave me the thing that mattered most. She was 81 when I was 12, sharp as a wire, with hands that had kneaded bread dough and signed contracts and done things I only understood much later. She sat me down one afternoon, the summer after my father died, and she said, quote 2. She didn't explain it. She just looked at me over her reading glasses and went back to her crossword. I wrote it in the back of that allowance notebook. I didn't understand it for a very long time. I put myself through engineering school on a partial scholarship and a lot of early mornings. My first job was with a mid-sized structural firm in Albany, doing assessments on commercial buildings. By the time I was 26, I was running my own small consultancy, just me and one junior engineer, taking on residential and light commercial projects in the Hudson Valley. It wasn't glamorous. I drove a 10-year-old Subaru and ate a lot of soup, but it was mine. Every client, every contract, every decision. Mine. I had one dry joke I used to tell at industry dinners when people asked how I'd managed to build something from nothing so young. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore 3, underscore, underscore. It always got a polite laugh. What I meant and what I didn't say was that I had structured my finances the way I structured everything else, carefully, redundantly, with escape routes built in at every load point. I had an operating account for the business and a personal account that no one, not a single person in my life, had ever had access to. Not because I was secretive. Because Nana Ruth had also said, in a different conversation, money that other people know about has a way of becoming other people's money. She was not a suspicious woman. She was an accurate one. I met Daniel Calloway at a conference in Philadelphia. He was presenting on real estate development financing, specifically on how to structure LLC agreements to protect investor assets in the event of project failure. He was good at it, confident without being loud, which I found genuinely attractive. He had a self-deprecating humor that felt earned rather than performed, and he asked me a question during the Q&A that was actually smart, which at an industry conference is rarer than you'd think. We got coffee the next morning. He was 41, recently relocated from Boston, in the process of establishing his own development firm in the Hudson Valley region. He said he'd been following a few of my projects, specifically a mixed-use renovation I'd done in Rhinebeck that had gotten a small write-up in an architectural trade publication. He said, quote 5, I remember thinking, he speaks my language. We dated for 8 months before I agreed to move in together, and another 14 before we got married. I am not an impulsive person. I did not rush. The first small thing that was wrong. About 4 months in, we had a conversation about splitting expenses in the apartment we'd started sharing. I suggested we each contribute equally to a joint household account and keep our personal finances separate, which is completely standard, completely reasonable, and what most financial advisors recommend for couples who both have businesses. He went quiet for a moment, just a beat too long. Then he said, I guess I just imagined it would be more integrated than that. More like we're actually building something together. It was soft, and it was said with a kind of mild sadness, and I adjusted. We kept separate accounts, but agreed to revisit the structure later. We never officially revisited it. But the conversation sat at the back of my mind, the way a small asymmetry in a foundation sits, barely perceptible, registered, and filed. The second small thing, we were at a dinner party, maybe 6 months after we started living together, at the home of a couple who were friends of his, Marcus and Diane, real estate attorneys, very polished, slightly competitive in the way of people who measure their lives against each other constantly. At some point, the conversation turned to my consultancy. I was explaining a project I was particularly proud of, a historic mill building I was helping convert into residential units, complex foundation work, interesting structural challenges, and Daniel laughed, a small, fond laugh, and said to Marcus, She speaks about load-bearing walls the way other people talk about art. And Marcus said something polite, and I thought for just a second. He just made me the subject of an anecdote, not a partner with a story, but a charming detail in his story. I filed that one too. The third thing, and this one I noticed most clearly in retrospect, Daniel did not like the word no. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would have triggered alarm bells. He liked it the way a finely calibrated instrument doesn't like humidity. It didn't break anything. It just made everything run a little wrong for a while afterward. When I declined to join his LLC as a named partner in the early months of our relationship, I had good reasons, liability reasons, practical and defensible. He went quiet for 3 days. Not angry, not accusatory, just subtly, efficiently withdrawn. And then he came back and said with a warm smile that he understood completely. And somehow, within 2 weeks, the subject of a shared financial structure had reappeared in a slightly different form, and I had agreed to something smaller than what he'd originally asked for, but larger than what I'd originally been comfortable with. I noticed the pattern only much later. You usually do. There was one person who saw it in real time. My friend Naomi. We'd been close since grad school. She was an urban planner. Direct in the way of someone who has spent too much time in public comment meetings to have patience for anything soft and untrue. Naomi came to visit about 5 months before Daniel and I got engaged. We had dinner, just the two of us, and she listened to me talk about him for an hour, and then she said, quote 9, I said yes. She said, quote 10, I said, quote 11. Naomi looked at me. She has a very specific look she uses when she thinks you are reframing something that doesn't deserve reframing. She used it then. I said, Naomi, he's a good man. She picked up her wineglass. I know you believe that. I'm just saying, watch the pattern, not the exception. The pattern. I did not watch the pattern. I watched the exceptions. The thoughtful gesture when I had a difficult client. The way he showed up at a project site once, unannounced, just to see what I was talking about. The night I had a crisis with a contractor and he sat with me at the kitchen table for 2 hours, helping me think through options. Those were real. I want to be precise about this, because the story I'm telling isn't the story of a woman who missed all the signs. It's the story of a woman who saw some of the signs and made a reasonable judgment call that turned out to be wrong. There is a difference. We married in September. It was small, which we both wanted. 18 people, a restored farmhouse in Columbia County, my mother and Nana Ruth in the front row. In photographs, I look happy. I was happy. The marriage was good for the first 2 years. Not perfect. No marriage is, and I am skeptical of anyone who tells you otherwise, but functional, warm, genuinely collaborative in the ways that mattered. We bought a house together in the Hudson Valley. which I helped finance with a significant cash contribution from my business reserves. We structured the ownership jointly, and I remember thinking, at the closing, that this was the integrated thing he'd wanted, and I was glad to give it to him because the numbers worked, and I trusted him. That sentence will do a great deal of work later in this story. The numbers worked, and I trusted him. Daniel's development firm was doing well. He had 2 mid-size projects underway, a small apartment conversion in Kingston and a commercial strip renovation in Poughkeepsie, and he was working on bringing in outside investors for a larger mixed-use project in the city. He talked about it constantly in those first 2 years, the potential, the structure, the players involved. I listened. I asked questions. I was a reasonably informed partner. What I was not, and this was deliberate, and I thought it was healthy at the time, was involved. He had his business. I had mine. The crack appeared in March of our 3rd year. It was a small thing. I want to be clear about how small it was, because the size of the thing is important. It was a Tuesday evening. I had come home late from a site visit. I was tired. I dropped my bag in the kitchen, and Daniel was on his phone on the far side of the living room, which was normal. He was always on his phone. But as I came into the room, he picked it up off the coffee table, where it had been sitting face down, and slipped it into his jacket pocket without looking at the screen first. It was a single gesture that took less than a second. I went to the kitchen and made tea. I am not a jealous person. I am not a suspicious person by nature. But I am an engineer, and engineers notice things that are off by a fraction. That gesture was off by a fraction. A phone on a coffee table face down is a person who wants privacy. A phone slipped into a pocket the moment someone else enters the room is something slightly different. I did not say anything that night. I didn't say anything for 2 weeks, but something in my file system had opened a new folder and quietly started collecting. 2 weeks later, I was going over our joint household account. I reviewed it monthly as part of routine, nothing dramatic, and I found a restaurant charge I didn't recognize. $172 at a place called Oriel in the city on a Thursday night. I thought back to the Thursday in question. Daniel had told me he was having dinner with his investor group, the team working on the mixed-use project. That was a standing dinner they had periodically. $172 was within range for a business dinner. What was slightly off was that it was charged to the joint household account rather than his business card. He occasionally mixed up which card he used. That had happened before. I noted it and moved on, but the file in my head kept a copy. The third thing was a conversation about the mixed-use project that didn't add up. He'd been telling me the investor funding was almost finalized. 3 weeks? He'd been saying 3 weeks? For 8 weeks. Each time I gently mentioned the timeline, he had a new explanation. The lead investor had a competing project going into due diligence, the attorney had a conflict, the city planning approval was delayed. All plausible. Each individual explanation was completely plausible. But I am someone who works with timelines for a living, and I know what a structurally sound timeline looks like, and what one that is being improvised looks like. Something in his project timeline was being improvised. I said one evening, very mildly, "Is there anything I should know about the project status? You seem stressed." He said immediately, with a fluency that was just slightly too clean, "It's just the usual development headaches. Nothing that's going to affect us. I've got it handled." He smiled. He touched my face. He changed the subject. "A response that is too clean is the same as a load calculation that comes out to a perfect round number. In structural work, that tells you someone fudged the math. Real numbers are messy. I added it to the file." I want to describe the state of mind I was in during this period because it matters. I was not panicking. I was not in denial. I was in a kind of suspended assessment, the same place I go when I'm doing a preliminary evaluation on a building, and I found some indicators that something might be wrong, but I don't yet have enough data to know whether it's cosmetic or catastrophic. You don't tear out the walls before you know what you're dealing with. You document. You look for more indicators. You stay calm, and you keep looking. The thing that broke the suspension open was not something I found. It was something that walked up and introduced itself. It was a Saturday morning. Farmer's market, which I went to every week. A habit from before Daniel, one of the small autonomous rhythms of my life I'd kept intact throughout the marriage. I was at the vegetable stand when someone touched my arm, and I turned around, and it was a woman I'd met twice before at development industry events, Priya Khatri, a real estate attorney. We'd had a brief and pleasant conversation once about a zoning variance case she was working on. We were not friends. We were cordial professional acquaintances. She said, quote 16. She stopped. Quote 17. I looked at her. I said, quote 18. I said it with the same tone I used to acknowledge receipt of a structural report. She looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people do when they expect more reaction and don't get it. She said, I'm sorry. I said, don't be. I mean that. Thank you. I finished my shopping. I drove home. I unloaded the vegetables. I put the kettle on. And I sat at the kitchen table and felt my entire internal architecture settle and realign into something very still and very cold, like water freezing from the surface down. I did not cry. I want to be precise about this. I did not cry because I was not surprised. I had had a folder labeled Possible in my filing system for months, and Priya Khatri had just handed me a document that promoted it to Probable. What I felt was not heartbreak in the way people describe heartbreak. It was more like standing in a building you've assessed and watching the exact crack you documented 3 reports ago propagate exactly the way you predicted it would. There is a particular kind of terrible feeling in being right about the worst thing. What I decided, sitting at that table, was this. I was going to find out exactly what I was dealing with before I moved 1 inch in any direction. Not a confrontation, not an accusation. Information first, architecture first. Know what the structure looks like before you decide how to take it down or whether it can be saved. I sat there for about 40 minutes. Daniel came downstairs at some point, asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said I had some project work I needed to finish and could we do it tomorrow. He said sure, kissed the top of my head, made himself breakfast. He was completely relaxed, completely normal. I noted that too. The first person I called was not a lawyer. It was my accountant, Tom Beller, who had been my business accountant for 6 years and was the kind of man who wore the same cardigan every time I saw him and could quote tax code subsections from memory and had never once, in 6 years, given me advice that cost me money. I told him I needed a full accounting audit of every entity I had any financial connection to, personal and business, and I needed it quietly, and I needed to know if there was anything in any of those structures that had changed or been modified in the last 3 years that I hadn't explicitly authorized. Tom said, "Should I be concerned?" I said, "Yes." Tom said, "Give me 2 weeks." I gave him 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, I also did something that was psychologically difficult in a way I didn't fully anticipate. I kept being married. I came home. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I listened to him talk about the mixed-use project with the same attentive, supportive expression I had always brought to those conversations. I went to a dinner party with his friends and laughed at the right moments. I slept in the same bed. I did not once, in 2 weeks, let on that anything had changed. I am not by nature a person who is comfortable with performance. I find most performance, social performance, professional posturing, the way people perform confidence they don't have, vaguely exhausting. But this was different. This was a structural requirement. If he knew I was looking, he would move things. Engineers do controlled demolition all the time. You don't announce the charge placement. What I did do, in those 2 weeks, was go back through my own records with a specificity I hadn't previously applied. Not because I'm careless, I've never been careless, but because I had not previously been looking for deliberate concealment. There is a difference between reviewing your records for accuracy and reviewing them for manipulation. The second requires a different lens, and with the second lens, I found the first solid thing. It was in the records for the house. Our house, the one we'd bought 3 years earlier, the one I'd contributed a substantial cash payment toward. The property records, which are public, showed a refinancing that had happened 14 months prior. A refinancing I had never been told about and had not signed off on. Or, and this was the thing that took my breath away, in the way that only a truly precise wrong can, I had signed off on it. My signature was on the document. My signature, which I did not write. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I photographed the document, saved it in 3 places, closed the file, made tea. I called Tom the next day and told him specifically to look at the property records and the Meridian account, which was a business investment account Daniel had suggested we open jointly 2 years in to house the appreciation assets, and which I had agreed to largely because the tax structure made sense, and I trusted him. The file I had been building had just upgraded from probable to certain, and the question was no longer whether something was wrong, but how large it was and how far back it went. Tom called me 8 days later. He asked if I could come to his office. I went to his office. He had a spreadsheet open that was 4 pages long when printed and a folder of documents next to it. He had the look of a man who has found something in a wall that should not be in a wall. He said, "Why, Claire, how much do you know?" I said, "Start from the beginning." What Tom had found, methodically assembled and cross-referenced with the precision that had made me his client for 6 years, was this. Over the course of approximately 2 years, beginning roughly 8 months after we were married, Daniel had been systematically repositioning assets that were either jointly held or in which I had a financial interest. The refinancing on the house, unauthorized, forged signature, had extracted equity that had been deposited into an LLC I had never heard of. The Meridian account had been used as a pass-through to channel funds into a separate account in Daniel's name only, via a series of transfers that were individually small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. 3 of my business contracts, clients who had been referred through our shared professional network, had renewal clauses that contained a consulting fee provision routed to a company called Ashworth Callaway Consulting LLC, of which I was listed as a 10% member and Daniel as 90%, which I had never agreed to and which I had ostensibly, quote, 31 via a digital signature on a document that had been presented to me 18 months earlier as a routine tax form. The total amount that had been redirected or was at risk of being redirected was in the range of $340,000, not including the house equity, which added another $180,000. $500,000, give or take. Methodical, patient, designed to be invisible. I looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then I looked at Tom, who was watching me with the expression of a man who is prepared to call someone if necessary. I said, quote, 32. Tom blinked. I said, quote, 33. Tom said, quote, 34. I said, quote, 35. He said, quote, 36. I said, quote, 37. I drove home. Daniel was not there. He was at a site meeting. He'd texted me at noon. I walked through the house. I looked at the kitchen table where we'd sat for 2 hours on the night I had a contractor crisis. I looked at the living room where the phone had been placed face down on the coffee table. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of our bedroom. I thought about Nana Ruth and her crossword puzzle and her reading glasses. The most dangerous thing in the world is a person who needs you to be smaller than you are. I went back downstairs and made a list. Over the next 6 weeks, I became the most organized person I had ever been in my life, which is saying something, because I have been a very organized person for a very long time. The first call I made, the morning after my meeting with Tom, was to a divorce attorney named Margaret Chen, who had been recommended to me by a woman in my professional network. Not someone close to Daniel, not someone in his orbit, someone who existed entirely in my own sphere. Margaret was 54, had been doing matrimonial law for 22 years, had a reputation in the Hudson Valley legal community for being extraordinarily thorough and completely unsentimental. She wore her silver hair in a precise cut and had the ability to make you feel, within the first 10 minutes, that you were in the company of someone who had seen every possible version of this particular disaster and was not alarmed by any of them. I sat in her office on a Wednesday morning, and I laid out, in order, everything Tom had found. The forged signature, the LLC, the Meridian transfers, the Ashworth Callaway consulting structure, the total figures. Margaret listened without interrupting. She took notes in a small, cramped handwriting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, ___, quote __38, ___, I said, Margaret wrote the name down. Margaret nodded slowly. She turned to a clean page. What I wanted was specific, and I had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. I wanted the house, not because of sentiment, but because my money had gone into it, and the forged refinancing meant it was encumbered in a way that needed to be unwound, and I was the one with the income stream to service the mortgage cleanly. I wanted full dissolution of the Ashworth Callaway Consulting LLC with an accounting of every dollar that had passed through it. I wanted the Meridian account funds restored, with interest, because they had been my investment income used without my knowledge or consent. I wanted the forged signature pursued, because Margaret had explained to me that mortgage fraud is a federal matter, and that the document Tom had found was prosecutable. And while I was not primarily interested in criminal prosecution, I was interested in having it as a fact in the room during negotiation, and I wanted it done before Daniel knew I was doing it, to the greatest extent possible. Margaret said, quote, 44, quote, I said, quote, 45, quote, she said, quote, 46, quote, I said, quote, 47, quote, she said, quote, 48, quote, I said, quote, 49, quote, Margaret Chen became, for the next month, my most important professional relationship. We spoke almost every day. She was meticulous in a way I recognized. She documented everything, cross-referenced everything, and had a paralegal's assistant named Jules who could run property records in 3 counties simultaneously and appeared to never sleep. I liked Margaret enormously. Not warmly, exactly. She was not a warm person. But with the specific appreciation you feel for someone who is genuinely excellent at something difficult. The ally I needed wasn't Margaret, though. Margaret was my attorney. The ally I needed was someone who could help me maintain the performance. That was Naomi. I called Naomi on a Sunday. I told her what I knew. I told her what I was doing. I told her I needed her to be the one person who knew everything, because operating entirely alone for weeks on end without a single person to tell the truth to is not psychologically sustainable, and I needed to be psychologically sustainable. Naomi listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a full 30 seconds, which for Naomi is a very long time. Then she said, I want you to know that I am not saying I told you so. I said, I know. She said, but I am feeling the feeling. I said, I know. Naomi, can you help me? She said, tell me what you need. What I needed was practical. Naomi lived 45 minutes away. I needed on 2 specific occasions over the next month to have a believable alibi for being out of the house for a significant portion of a day, specifically for 2 meetings with Margaret and Tom together, which needed to happen in person. I told Daniel I was helping Naomi with a renovation project. She was legitimately thinking about converting her attic, so there was enough truth in it to give it texture. Naomi confirmed this if he asked, which he did once, in a casual way that suggested he wasn't actually suspicious, but was maintaining the habit of light monitoring that I had only recently started to accurately identify as a habit. The day he asked was a Saturday. I was in the kitchen when he came downstairs and said, quote _ 55 _. He was making coffee, not looking at me. The question tossed out in the manner of someone who is not particularly interested in the answer, but wants the question noted. I said, quote, 56. He laughed. It was a fond laugh. He said, quote, 57. And that was it. The subject dropped. He poured his coffee and went to look at something on his laptop, and the conversation was over. I stood at the counter and felt the specific flatness of having just said something not quite true to someone who deserved to have true things said to them, once, long ago, and had forfeited the right somewhere along the way. It was not guilt. It was more like looking at a building, has to come down and feeling sad about what it used to be, before the inspection showed you what was under the walls. Naomi also did one other thing, which was to come and have dinner with us one Saturday, as she had done periodically throughout our marriage. She sat across from Daniel and was completely normal. Warm, funny, appropriately argumentative about a city planning topic they both had opinions on. And afterward, driving home, she called me and said, quote, 58, quote, I said, quote, 59, quote, she said, quote, 60, quote, I said, quote, 61, quote. He had no idea, because he had written a story about me and was living inside it. And in his story, I was a capable but limited woman who loved him, was slightly financially naive despite her professional competence, and would be devastated when the time came. The thing about a story that someone else writes about you is that it gives you complete freedom to be something different, because they're not looking, they're reading. I want to describe the specific performance because it has a shape. The performance of a wife who doesn't know, a wife who is a little tired, a little distracted by her own work, occasionally affectionate, occasionally distant, in the way of someone who has a lot of projects on her desk. I did not perform happiness. That would have been too much, too different from baseline. I performed ordinary. The ordinary of someone who is running a consultancy and is a little overwhelmed and trusts her husband to handle the financial architecture while she handles her own lane. Daniel's business partner, a man named Greg Finch, who I had never liked and who had never made an effort to like me, came to the house for dinner about 2 weeks into my preparation period. Greg was the kind of person who manages relationships like transactions. Everything is an exchange, everything is positioned. He had a way of speaking to me that managed to be both superficially cordial and subtly dismissive, as if I were an attractive but unnecessary fixture that Daniel had decided to keep around. At dinner, the conversation turned to the mixed-use project, and I asked a question about the investor structure, a genuine question, the kind I might have asked at any point in our marriage. And Greg looked at Daniel and said, quote 62. He said it like a joke. He said it like I was a child who had learned a new word. Daniel smiled and said, quote 63. Greg said, quote 64, and steered the conversation elsewhere. I smiled. I refilled his water glass. I made a very good risotto and said nothing for the rest of the meal that was in any way remarkable. After Greg left, Daniel said, quote 65. He always said that about Greg. It was not, strictly speaking, accurate. I said, quote 66. And I smiled, and I cleared the table, and I went upstairs and updated my notes. The thing I want to say about Nana Ruth's mother-in-law, Daniel's mother, Diane Calloway, is that she was not a villain in a cartoon sense. She was something more precise and therefore more difficult. She was a woman who had decided, early in her son's life, that every woman he was with was a threat to his potential, and she had spent decades perfecting a system of management that looked, from the outside, like warmth, and was, on the inside, a continuous low-grade campaign of diminishment. She had called me dear in a tone of faint condescension since the first time we met. She asked about my consultancy in the manner of someone inquiring about a hobby. When I had mentioned, at a family dinner about 2 years in, that I had won a significant contract for a commercial building renovation, genuinely significant, it represented a meaningful expansion of my firm's portfolio. She had said, quote 68, and turned to Daniel and asked him about his project in a way that simply absorbed the conversation and moved on, the way a current absorbs a small object thrown into it. The specific moment I want to tell you about happened about 10 days before the end. She had come for lunch, just the two of us. Daniel was at a meeting, and we were eating on the back porch, and she said, in a very gentle and solicitous way, quote, 69. She paused. Quote, 70, I said. Quote, 71, she said. Quote, 72. I looked at her. I thought about the folder on my laptop with the forensic financial report, the 9 documents Margaret had filed, the 4 accounts that had been quietly restructured back into my control, the 3 conversations I'd had with Tom in the past 2 weeks, and the meeting I had scheduled for Friday at which everything was going to change. I said, I'm doing everything I need to do. She tilted her head with the faint smile of a woman who believes she has just confirmed a suspicion. I just think Daniel deserves someone who's fully present. I smiled at her. It was a genuine smile in its own way. It was the smile of someone who knows exactly what is in the folder on their laptop. I said, I think everyone deserves to be fully seen. She heard it as a non-answer. She was wrong. The document that mattered most was not the forensic accounting report, although that was essential. The document that mattered most was a single email chain that Tom had found when he went through the business records associated with the Ashworth Calloway Consulting, LLC. The LLC had an email address, Ashworth.Callaway.Consulting, a domain that had been registered without my knowledge 14 months earlier. Daniel had used that email address for LLC correspondence, which was how Tom had been able to access it, because the LLC was a legal entity in which I was a listed member and therefore had access rights to its records. The email chain was between Daniel and a man named Kevin Park, who turned out to be a real estate financier in New York City. The chain covered a period of 8 months. It documented, in the specific and unguarded language of two people who believe they are in a private conversation, a plan. The plan was this: Daniel would pursue a divorce settlement in which he would argue that I was a minority partner in the Ashworth Callaway Consulting LLC and therefore entitled to 10% of its assets, while he, as majority partner, was entitled to 90%. He would argue that the house equity, which had been refinanced and restructured, was business debt, not marital equity, and therefore not subject to division. He would use the divorce process to attempt to transfer the Meridian account to the LLC, at which point the LLC funds would be redirected to a separate structure managed by Kevin Park. The total amount he was planning to extract was explicitly stated in one email as somewhere north of $400K, and that's before the real estate. Kevin Park, in one of the later emails, had written, "Is she going to fight it?" Daniel had written back, "She doesn't have the financial sophistication to know what to fight. She's going to think this is just what divorce costs." I read that email 3 times. I printed it. I put it in the folder. I called Margaret. Margaret, for the first time in our weeks of working together, went completely quiet on the phone. Then she said, "This is extraordinary." I said, "I know." She said, "Claire, with this documentation, I can end this in 1 meeting." I said, "Good. Schedule the meeting." Before we get to what happens next, and trust me, you are not ready, if this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single comment. Okay, back to the part where everything finally falls apart for everyone who deserved it. The meeting was scheduled as a mediation session for the purpose of finalizing divorce settlement terms. Daniel had been served the previous week. When I say he was served, when I say the papers appeared in his hand on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. when he was about to leave for a site visit, I want to describe his face because I was there, because I had decided, with Margaret's agreement, that it was better for me to be there, so that there was a witness to his reaction and so that I could see it. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. He said, "Claire," I said, "my attorney will be in touch with yours. Please don't contact me except through legal counsel." Then I went upstairs, picked up the bag I had packed 3 days earlier and placed in the back of the closet, and I left. His first call to me came 45 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. His attorney contacted Margaret that afternoon. The position they staked out was exactly what the email chain had predicted. The LLC structure, the house equity argument, the Meridian account transfer. They came in exactly as scripted. Margaret called me that evening and said, "He has no idea what we have." I said, "Good." The mediation was held at a law firm in Poughkeepsie, a neutral location, which was the right choice for the type of meeting this was going to be. The setup was standard: a conference room, a long table, a mediator at the head, both attorneys on either side of their respective clients. Daniel arrived in a dark suit that I recognized. He wore it to closings, to important meetings. He had dressed for a transaction. I wore a gray wool dress I'd had for years, and flat shoes. I had my folder in a document bag. I had slept 7 hours the night before, which is 2 more than I usually sleep before a significant professional engagement. Daniel sat down across from me and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as preemptive sympathy. The expression of someone who knows they are going to win and is already preparing to be gracious about it. It is a very specific expression. I had seen it on his face in other contexts, and only now was I naming it accurately. His attorney, a man named Richard Alton, who I was told was well regarded in matrimonial circles, opened the session by laying out their position. The LLC structure, the house equity characterization, the Meridian account. It was delivered with confidence, and a kind of fluid precision that suggested he had rehearsed it. When he finished, Margaret said, she opened her folder. She placed the first document in the center of the table. Daniel's eyes went to it. Margaret said, "This is the record of the refinancing executed on the marital property in March of last year. Could you help us understand who executed this signature on behalf of Claire Ashworth Calloway?" She paused. "Because we've had it independently examined by a forensic document analyst, who will testify that it is not her signature." Silence. Richard Alton looked at Daniel. A microsecond of something crossed Daniel's face. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was the quick recalibration of a person who has encountered something they expected to be months away. He said calmly, "There may have been an administrative error in the document processing." Margaret placed the second document on the table. "This is the corporate filing for Ashworth Calloway Consulting, LLC, showing the registered member structure. Here is a digital signature on the operating agreement, attributed to Claire. Here," she placed a third document, "is an expert opinion stating that this digital signature was generated without Ms. Ashworth's knowledge or consent, using a methodology that constitutes signature forgery under New York state law." Richard Alton was now very still. Margaret placed the fourth document on the table. "This is the Meridian account transaction history, cross-referenced to transfers into the LLC's operating account. Total redirected, $214,000 over 22 months. The fifth document. "This is an email chain, retrieved through the LLC's business email account, to which Ms. Ashworth has member access rights, between Mr. Calloway and Kevin Park, a real estate financier in New York City, dated between February and October of this past year." She looked at Daniel. "Would you like me to read the relevant portions aloud, or would you prefer to take a moment to review them privately?" Daniel had gone white, not pale, white, the way a load-bearing wall looks when you've just removed the column it was resting on. Richard Alton put his hand on Daniel's arm. He leaned over and said something very quietly. Daniel did not respond. Greg Finch had somehow been included in Daniel's support team. He was not an attorney. He had been characterized as a business advisor to the proceeding, and he had been sitting at the far end of the table with the air of someone who expects to be useful. He said, quote 97, quote Margaret turned to him with a patience that was extremely precise. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore 98, underscore, underscore Greg Finch did not say anything else for the rest of the meeting. The mediator, who had been taking careful notes, looked at Richard Alton. Richard Alton said, "They went into the hallway for 11 minutes. I know because I timed it. I sat at the table and looked at the documents arranged in front of me and felt something that I can only describe as architectural. Things were sitting where they were supposed to sit. Load was distributing correctly. When they came back, Daniel's entire posture had changed. He was sitting lower. The expensive suit was somehow wearing him rather than the other way around." Richard Alton said, "We'd like to discuss a full settlement." Margaret said, "We're already prepared to offer terms." She placed the final document, a draft settlement agreement that Tom and Margaret and I had worked on for a week, in the center of the table. "Ms. Ashworth receives the property, unencumbered, with the refinancing costs addressed by a credit against Mr. Calloway's share of marital assets. The Meridian account is restored in full, with interest. The Ashworth Calloway Consulting LLC is dissolved, and its current assets are distributed 100% to Ms. Ashworth as compensation for unauthorized use of her identity and business relationships. Mr. Calloway agrees not to pursue any further claims against Ms. Ashworth's personal business accounts or consultancy, and all of this is contingent on his executing a complete disclosure of all asset movements during the marriage that have not yet been documented." Richard Alton looked at the document. He said, "The LLC distribution?" Margaret said, "Richard, he forged her signature on a mortgage document. That is a federal crime. The email chain documents premeditation and conspiracy. We have not yet spoken to the district attorney's office. We can have that conversation before or after this settlement is signed. Your call." Another silence. Daniel looked at me. It was the first time our eyes had met directly in the entire meeting. I have thought about what I would say about that look, because I want to be accurate and I don't want to overdramatize. He looked at me the way a person looks at a structure they thought was one thing and have just understood is something completely different. It was not quite incomprehension. It was more like the specific quality of being wrong about the most important thing. I looked back at him. I said, quote, 106, not a threat, not a performance, just true. He looked away. He said to Richard Alton, quote, 107. The settlement was executed later that afternoon. The whole meeting had lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. I noted the time because I am the kind of person who notes the time. In the weeks that followed, the pieces settled into their places the way pieces do when the structure has been correctly designed. Daniel's development firm did not survive the divorce proceedings. The Kevin Park project had been predicated on the funds from the Meridian account being available for the larger mixed-use development, and when those funds were returned to me, the project's financing structure collapsed. Kevin Park, as it turned out, had 3 other investors in that project, and when it fell apart, they had questions. Some of those questions became legal proceedings that I was not directly involved in, but about which I was occasionally informed. Daniel spent approximately 4 months in the process of unwinding his firm's obligations. The last thing I heard from a mutual professional contact was that he had taken a salaried position with a larger development company in another state. A salaried position. After years of presenting himself as a principal. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's what happened. Greg Finch, who had been on the wrong side of Margaret Chen's patience in the conference room, apparently had his own exposure in the LLC's business activities that became clearer once the full accounting was done. He and Daniel had a falling out that was described to me third-hand as dramatic. I have no direct knowledge. I only know that Greg's cheerful dismissiveness, the water glass refilling, the risotto I made and said nothing about, none of it was for nothing. Diane Calloway sent me a letter 2 months after the settlement. It was handwritten, 3 pages, a remarkable document in its own right. It managed to frame everything that had happened as a consequence of my emotional unavailability and my failure to be quote, _108, in the marriage, while also implying that I had somehow been calculating throughout, and that this was a form of cruelty. She asked in the final paragraph if we could speak. I did not respond. This is not because I felt nothing about her letter. I felt something. I read it carefully, and I thought about her son and what she had built in him and what it had cost her, ultimately, as much as it had cost me. But there was nothing to say that was worth saying, and nothing she wanted to hear that was true, and the silence was cleaner and more honest than any response I could have crafted. Naomi called me the evening of the settlement. She said, quote, 109. I told her everything. There was a pause on the line when I got to the part about the conference room. Then she said, quote, 110, quote, I said, quote, 111, quote, she said, quote, 112, quote. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in a long time, the kind that starts somewhere low and surprised. I sat on the floor of the kitchen in the house that was now entirely mine, with my back against the cabinet where the tea was kept, and I laughed until I was crying a little. And then I stopped and just felt the floor under me and the quiet and the specific weight of something that was over. The house needed work. The refinancing and its unwinding had left some administrative complications that took months to fully clear, and there were structural repairs I'd been putting off because it hadn't felt right to invest in something I wasn't sure I'd keep. I kept it. I hired a contractor I'd worked with before, a woman named Sandra who did meticulous work and never oversold the scope, and we spent 3 weeks that fall addressing the foundation issues in the east corner and replacing the rotting window frames on the second floor. I was on site every morning. I made coffee on Sandra's portable burner, and we talked about load calculations and the particular personality of old houses and what they need to keep standing. I got a cat. His name is Copley, after Copley Square in Boston, which is where I'd had one of my better professional days, years ago, before all of this. He is large and opinionated, and has claimed the chair by the south window with the decisiveness of someone who has given the matter careful thought. I find him deeply soothing. He has no interest in my professional opinions, my financial history, or the folder of forensic documents that I still keep, out of habit, or perhaps out of a structural engineer's instinct to retain load-bearing records, in the filing cabinet in the second bedroom. He is interested in breakfast, in the patch of afternoon sun, and occasionally in sitting on whatever I am trying to read. This seems to me like the correct set of priorities. My mother came to stay for a week in November. She slept in the spare room, and we cooked together in the mornings, and she did not ask too many questions about Daniel, because she is the daughter of a woman who knew when to say nothing, and she absorbed the same lesson. On her last morning, she sat at the kitchen table and watched me make tea and said, "Your grandmother would have liked how this turned out." I said, "Tell me why." She said, "Because you didn't do it for spite. You did it because the numbers were wrong and you fixed them." She paused. Ruth always said the most reliable people are the ones who can read a balance sheet without flinching. I handed her the tea. I said, "I think she said a lot of things I'm still understanding." My mother looked at me over the rim of her mug in a way that was very much the way Nana Ruth had looked at me over her reading glasses all those years ago, and she said, "That's how it works, sweetheart." My consultancy had been unaffected by everything. I had kept it completely separated as I had from the beginning, and none of the legal proceedings touched its accounts or its contracts or its professional standing. In the year after the settlement, I took on two of the larger projects I'd turned down during the marriage because they would have required too much travel, and I'd been managing the performance of a present wife. I went to Portland for 6 weeks to work on a historic warehouse conversion. I went to Chicago for a long weekend for a conference and stayed 3 extra days and walked and ate and did not explain myself to anyone. My business grew by about 22% that year, which is the kind of number that Tom reports to me with a satisfaction he keeps carefully professional. I think about Nana Ruth. I think about the crossword puzzle and the reading glasses and the way she said it without explanation. The most dangerous thing in the world is a person who needs you to be smaller than you are. I understood it differently at 12, differently at 20, and I understand it now in the specific and cellular way of someone who has lived inside it and come out the other side. If I were going to say something to myself, the version of me who was standing at the farmer's market vegetable stand, while Priya Khatri touched her arm and said, "I want you to know I've been thinking about whether to say something," I would say, "You already know what to do. You have always known what to do. The math is not complicated. The question is only whether you'll trust your own calculations." I was at my office last Tuesday late afternoon. The light was the particular amber that only happens in October, coming through the west window and making the blueprints on the desk glow a little. I had a mug of tea that had gone cold. I was working on a proposal for a mixed-use development, the same category of project that Daniel had spent years pursuing and never completed. And I was making notes in the margins, recalculating a load distribution I'd gotten slightly wrong in the first pass. The building I was designing would outlast me. It would outlast everyone who had any stake in this story. It would stand because the calculations were right. I finished the page. I made fresh tea. I sat at my desk in my office, in a life that was mine down to the molecular level, and I thought about what comes next. That is always the better direction. Thank you so much for watching. If you loved this story, more of my most gripping stories are already on your screen right now. Click one. I promise you won't stop watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. New stories every week. See you in the next one.